All right. I think there are a number of very, very interesting questions here, but maybe Professor Lemmy, you want to start commenting, and then we can take questions on comments and observations from everybody else, right? Of course, Professor Marotti as well. And Jose. So now the idea is for us to get together and talk and discuss these ideas. I have some questions, but I'll shut up for a while and ask Professor Lemon to comment on this, please.
Can you hear me? Is this on? No? Yeah, it's on? Okay. So mine is actually, it's a comment that really is a question, actually, for both professors who just have spoken. Because what's fascinating is that you two actually gave quite distinct readings of Henry V, in the sense that Professor Marotti's reading of Henry V suggests that he fits into a tradition of Machiavellian Shakespeare rulers who, in a sense, we might say from a legal perspective, sort of operate by reason of state. So that, like Machiavelli, the idea is what makes a good ruler? A good ruler is an effective ruler. And an effective ruler is somebody who operates by pragmatism, by necessity, so that, in a certain sense, law is sort of suspended, in the name of necessity or pragmatism. And against that, we have the response that says, actually, Henry V, Hal, is a ruler who is governed by conscience, who is aware of, for example, Salic law. And so the question, I suppose, that this kind of opposition between, or oppositional readings of Henry V suggest is what makes a good ruler? Because I think that actually you're right. Professor Rinaldo, is that right? Yeah. I think you're right and I think Professor Marotti was also suggesting this, that Henry V is probably, if we were to scan the Shakespeare canon and we were to think, who is the best ruler in Shakespeare? It might well be Henry V. He's the one that we point to as being successful. That's always the play that appears as kind of the most British nationalist play. And so I suppose that the play Henry V makes us ask, what produces a good ruler? And is a good ruler produced through effectiveness, a kind of Machiavellian successfulness in negotiating with his subjects? Or is a good ruler produced out of, say, his ability to rule underneath the law? And I think that second idea, that the good ruler is one who obeys his or her country's laws, I think that Shakespeare puts a fair bit of pressure on that idea, because I think that in the passages that you directed our attention to, what comes across is not necessarily Hal's or Henry V's subordination to law, but instead his good character. And I think that's something that we might think about in terms of what it is that Shakespeare brings to the table, because this issue of good character or conscience is one in which, in other words, is a good ruler really only the person who's basically just good? Is it not laws that make a good ruler, but just the fact that the person has a conscience, that they submit themselves to others? And so I don't know if this is helpful in terms of our discussion, but I think that the question of kind of character, conscience, morality is one that is implicit in so much of the kind of political theory of the period, and I think that's one way in which Shakespeare becomes a really key player for thinking about kind of reason of state arguments versus constitutional arguments, so that the state can't necessarily be legislated into being a good one. That can be very problematic, and I think that might get us back to the kind of skepticism that Professor Marotti's paper brought out, which is that ultimately we do come to quite a skeptical realization if we say the only thing that makes a sort of state sort of effective or generous toward its own people is just the good character of its rulers. We like to think that maybe the Constitution can actually legislate good leadership. But anyway, that's just a start for our conversation.
If I might respond to both the comment, I've found your comment very rich in setting out the intellectual traditions from medieval notions of sovereignty and law and the state, carrying over as a language that people are familiar with and that can be tapped into, and certainly Baudin articulating a strong notion of sovereignty for a ruler. That's there. But I think that's one thing that Shakespeare is staging against the kind of Machiavellian side of behavior that Henry has. You talk about the beginning of the play. Yes, the bishops say that Henry has staged a kind of reformation of his behavior, but we see in Henry IV, Part 1, that he's been doing this as a theatrical performance. His very first soliloquy in Henry IV, Part 1 is, people think I'm paraphrasing, people think I'm a ne'er-do-well truant, but I'm going to stage my reformation so people will be dazzled when they see me reformed. So he's got this under control from the beginning. He becomes a king. The first scene of the play is crucial for setting up a kind of, for the audience, a recognition of a conflict of interest among these clergymen. The play starts off talking about there's a bill in Parliament that's going to take away a lot of church lands. And at this point, the king is the only thing preventing that from happening. So they need the king on their side. Second scene comes, and the king goes to them saying, just give your moral opinion about whether it's legitimate to invade France. And they say, oh, yes, it's all right to invade. They're protecting their own interests in that. And they're speaking a language of morality and of putting together the responsibility of kingship and a moral code, but they're the wrong people to make an impartial judgment because they have a conflict of interest. Then the whole business about Salic law, which interestingly has a big debate in France during the time of Henry IV, because his Catholic League opponents, I think, are trying to use Salic law against him and delegitimate his rule. So, to use Salic law to say I really rightfully inherit French sovereignty is a stretch. It's a stretch for an English audience. It's a stretch for anybody who looks at the legal realities of the situation. He's looking for a pretext to invade France. So it's a very equivocal kind of situation. At the end of the play, you get an epilogue when everybody's feeling great about, look at this, England has won, he's got a beautiful French queen, everything is happy. Then the epilogue tells you very quickly all this stuff that he won just got lost by his son, Henry VI. And it all came to naught. And Henry VI has a reputation in 16th century of being almost a saint. He's a saintly king, but he's completely inept. So if you want an effective king, you're not going to necessarily rely upon a saint to be ruling the country. You need somebody who can pull the right strings, who can trot out a language of God and morality and such when it suits him. And so I'm very skeptical of the good character of Henry V. We like him. He's very versatile. He can talk to anybody, low or high. He can do moves, emotional and intellectual and psychological moves, better than any other character. But is he a good man? He's a Machiavellian successful prince. Okay.
Yeah, I would like to comment just a couple of things.
I like this kind of tennis debate.
Yeah, it won't last long. I think we could read the play. I'm not saying we have to read it one way or another. I think the tension is there exactly. Maybe a few things could help us read. I was thinking of Herman Kantorovic's book, The King's Two Bodies. So one of the things we could say is that as a king, he's a good king, but he doesn't have to be a good person. Right. So what you're showing is exactly that. And that's also part of the traditional thought of the medieval scholars. They would say, well, if what you need to be a king is the virtues of the king, justice, which is not an individual virtue, but is the virtue you exercise and you have when you have the authority. And maybe that's what happens in the play, this tension between his personal interests and his capacity to transform them into universal or royal interests. So maybe that could help us read it.
If there's a character who spoils the party, Williams, the soldier.
Exactly.
He's the one who, when Henry makes the assertion that in disguise that the king's cause is just, he says, well, that's more.
That's what I was going to say. So you could read it. You could read in the play this structure. That of course he has a first right as a king coming from his inheritance, traditional law, the past history, but then the voice of the people is there at the very night before the battle. And then it could be the voice in his conscience, of course it's treated in a way like that, but it's also the voice of a structural player in a kingdom, and which is there. And I think this is I think that's the most interesting, of course, part of the play, and that's the very center of it.
He's not a yard, he has a conscience.
Right.
He worries about
Yeah, so yeah, but I mean, this is the tension. This is the beautiful thing about it, to bring all these influences around.
Why don't you, como você quiser. If you prefer, se preferir em português, tudo bem. Se preferir em inglês, eu sei que seu inglês é muito bom. Okay, right, okay.
Me desculpem.
Okay.
Prefiro falar em português.
Okay. So,
sorry, but my English is so
that's okay.
weak.
Just go slow and I'll try to translate as we go.
O tema é tão fascinante que eu venço a minha timidez, mas não ao ponto de falar inglês. É muito interessante ver o debate, porque, na verdade, os dois têm razão e nenhum dos dois tem razão.
You're both right and you're both wrong. That's what she's saying.
O fascinante no Shakespeare é porque exatamente ele consegue captar essa transição para a modernidade, né? Então, Zé Reinaldo olha para aquilo que Shakespeare ainda traz da tradição medieval, né? De uma noção de autovinculação do poder, mas num sentido de que o poder se vincula pela moral, que não encontra ainda um vínculo propriamente jurídico, portanto, absolutamente pré-constitucional, proto-constitucional, né? Mas eu olho muito naquilo que o Shakespeare já tem de moderno, né? E eu acho que o que ele mais tem de moderno é exatamente traduzir na forma do drama essa transição para a modernidade, né? Toda a ambiguidade do Shakespeare, né?
Okay, just to say that and the fact that you're both right and both wrong at the same time, it's a tribute to Shakespeare's complexity and the fact that he portrays the transition between early modern and modern. And she's saying that Professor José Reinaldo was focusing more on the medieval portion of Shakespeare plays, in which the moral, sort of a pre-constitutional aspect of kingship is more stressed. Please correct me if I'm mistranslating, and you too. So you're stressing more the moral, the pre-constitutional aspect of that, but also that she's very interested in the way that Shakespeare moves on to more modern forms of government, in which this legal framework tends to play a larger role, right? So and
Can I make one comment that part of what you're saying, I agree. Different people can give a different emphasis on things that are in debate in a Shakespeare play. That makes those plays very playable in succeeding centuries. Where particular, so for example, in the two movie versions of this play, Laurence Olivier wants to celebrate British patriotism, courage. He's doing this in the middle of World War II, at a time in which there are lots of propagandistic efforts to celebrate Englishness and what the values it embodies. Kenneth Branagh, after Vietnam and people's disgust of warfare, makes, first of all, he has the soldiers going through mud. It's not a pretty scene. He takes a much more cynical attitude towards warfare and the justification of warfare. So you get a very different version of Henry V. I mean, they're both coming out of the same text and two different interpretations, but in a way the text invites both emphases. And that's what's good about Shakespeare. His playability in different circumstances with different emphases. Yeah.
You wanted to complement?
Não, e exatamente essa possibilidade de múltiplas interpretações, né? Na verdade, ele está traduzindo aquilo que vai ser a descoberta da modernidade, né? Num contexto medieval, essa abertura interpretativa talvez não estivesse tão presente, né? Havia uma linearidade narrativa, né? Que já aferrava a compreensão desde sempre. Né? E é sempre possível uma dupla leitura, uma tripla leitura, enfim, muitos caminhos. Né? E me interessei muito pelo uso que ele faz da palavra soberania, que nós discutimos no artigo sobre a megera domada.
Yeah. Well, she's saying that, exactly these multiple readings that Shakespeare allows interests her very much, and it seems to her to be the transition actually to a modern mind frame, in the sense that the medieval mind frame, and that of course that's ground for debate, of course, but the medieval mind frame had a more well-defined center, right? So in which interpretation was, as she's putting it and calling attention to, interpretation was more sort of restricted to a canonical form, and that the fact that we are, Shakespeare allows us for different interpretations, I think make reference to what you said of Shakespeare's skepticism in a way, right? So Shakespeare's skepticism allows for a number of different readings, right? And that she thinks it's very important for understanding the rise of the modern mindset. And
Posso só completar?
Sure, absolutely.
O discurso final de Kate no Theme of the Show, ela se refere ao marido como meu soberano, né? Num uso que era muito comum, né? Tanto medieval quanto na Inglaterra do século XV, do início do século XVI, da palavra soberania, sovereignty, no contexto das relações entre marido e mulher. Mas o uso que Kate faz da palavra soberania ali, embora ressoe o uso pré-moderno, medieval do termo soberania, já traz elementos modernos. Né? E aí a ambiguidade do próprio discurso da Kate, né? Que nós não sabemos se ela é verdadeiramente uma mulher submissa ao seu marido e rendida, ou se ela está ironizando quando usa a palavra soberania ali, porque, no fundo, é ela quem reconhece no seu marido as qualidades que fazem dele um soberano. E aí nós já temos um uso moderno da soberania. Né? O soberano é aquele que tem determinadas qualidades.
Yeah, well, she's mentioned that we worked on a taming of the shrew, had a paper on that one, and which and we were very interested. She's very interested in the use of the word sovereignty, and Kate's famously controversial final speech, right? And the use she makes of the word sovereign, and she said that we can read this from a medieval point of view, that the husband is a sovereign, and the relation that I think that Professor Lopez alluded to, right? As the relation between husband and wife being a complementary, right? But uneven but complementary, but she also saying that it is also possible to read that final discourse as saying that the virtues of the husband come from the eyes of the wife. I mean, she's the one pointing out which virtues he has, which would perhaps move us to a more contractual perception of sovereignty. So there's ambiguity about the very notion of sovereignty may be at the heart of what's going on in this debate. You wanted to complement this? It's okay, right?
On the business of contract also, one of the backgrounds is what happened when Henry VIII wrote his will. Instead of having sovereignty pass genealogically to the next male heir, and that's it, Henry set up a will that Parliament ratified. So he needed the support of a kind of political elite, and it said, first comes Edward, his only son. Then comes Mary, his daughter by his first wife. Then comes the daughter of Anne Boleyn, his second wife. to set up the state as though it were subject like property to a will of somebody leaving a testament is a new thing. And it involves a sense that monarchy is now contractual, and party to that contract is a parliament that represents supposedly the voice of the people. So it's not mystified divine right sovereignty. It's something more contractual. Yeah.
Okay, I believe you have a. Yep. Oh, sorry.
No. I was just going to say on the marriage issue, which I think is quite interesting, that that to put it in the context of Henry VIII as well, I mean, you have a moment in which suddenly the spouse is incredibly important, right? So that if theories of household government say that there are certain hierarchies within the state that suggest that you have the ruler and you have the subordinates, and that is then mirrored within the context of marriage, in which you have, the well-ordered household where you have the dominant husband and the wife and the children all in hierarchical order. During a period where you have first the multiple marriages of Henry and then you have female rulership, I think that question of female rule then is just so complex in Shakespeare, because with something like Taming of the Shrew, yes, on the one hand, he's showing Kate's sort of capitulation, but also her coming into a sort of legitimate form of subjectivity, the way that she suddenly is most able to be herself within the context of maybe this marriage. On the other hand, we have her very witty and wry speech that may, in a theatrical context, suggest this isn't really the capitulation that, Petruchio is imagining it to be. So it's just to say that I think thinking through Shakespeare and questions of kind of of female rulership and female subordination, it's just such a rich topic, and it so much does relate to questions of sovereignty on a state level. All right.
When a wife opposes her husband, it's called petty treason. There's the parallel. Yeah.
And should be. All right. So we have some questions for the panelists. I think Rodrigo is in line. And we have two questions here. Of course, people are free to send written questions or raise their hands. I think Professor Sintra has raised his hand here.
Obrigado, professor Garcês. Eu vou falar em português também, com calma, e daí o professor faz a tradução. Okay. Na verdade, é uma questão apenas, um comentário que eu queria fazer no que diz respeito à questão do Henrique V ser um personagem que ainda está ligado a uma concepção medieval ou se ele tem uma perspectiva maquiaveliana, maquiavélica. Isso me interessa bastante.
Yeah, it's going to be again about Henry V, whether he's more of a medieval king or more of a Machiavellian king. So that's right.
A minha questão para os professores é a seguinte, é que o Henrique V ele tem um histórico, né? Na verdade, ele foi um personagem que é construído em duas peças anteriores, né? No caso, ele é construído com uma pessoa que vai, vamos dizer assim, ser o tutor dele, que é o Falstaff, né? Que é justamente o personagem Falstaff, que é um personagem que, em muitos sentidos, ele traz uma certa imoralidade que o Henrique, quando ele vai se transformar em Henrique V, ele vai ter que afastar.
Yeah, Henry V, I think he's bringing up to the panelists. He wants to hear everyone. Is that Henry V as a sovereign has a story. It comes from, of course, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and that story is deeply marked by Falstaff working as a preceptor for him, and Falstaff is arguably sort of immoral or flexible morally, and of course that this will Hall, when he becomes Henry, will reject this, but the lessons were there.
Yes. Na verdade, o que eu estou falando é que Henrique IV, primeira parte e segunda parte, ele tem um aprendizado, vamos dizer assim, com um tutor da malandragem, né, que é o Falstaff, que é o caso. Ele aprende muitas coisas, mas para ele se transformar o rei bom, o grande rei da época e tudo mais, ele vai ter que negar essa imoralidade, vamos dizer assim, que está ali no Falstaff, né? Então,
Yeah, he wants to comment on this. That okay, Falstaff. I mean, it's the streetwise immoral guy that teaches Hall everything Hall has to know about the world. But it's important, according to his reading, which I think is very interesting, that to become a good king, Henry has to reject all this. And if I may add, I mean, he has Falstaff hanged, right? Executed, was it? Banished. Sorry, yeah, banished. I mean, saying you don't belong here anymore, right? So want to start commenting on this, and then we pass on to the others.
I think I would go back again to what I said before, that his morality as a king is different from his morality as a person, or his morals as a king is different from his morals as a person. So he will have to make a choice, and I think he anticipates, in a time of controversy or just about civil war, that's what they are facing. The difference between England and France is that, in a way, the war is England is more like the what happened in Spain. The Inquisition is led by the crown, so the crown will get rid of the enemies of the faith. In this respect, is more like it. So King Henry is living. King Henry, of course, the play is being written in that time. So all those things appear in the play. I don't think he can give us any solution, because from the point of view of history, I would read that he doesn't know what's going to happen. So that's why also the play is so ambiguous. He doesn't know which is exactly the right way to go. So nobody knows at that time what's going to happen. They will need the Stuarts and James the First of England to start, organizing things in a more monarchical way, in a more modern way. At that time, they don't know. I think this is part of my reading of the play.
I want to say something about the rejection of Falstaff. Certainly in the Henry IV plays, anytime Falstaff comes on stage, the audience loves it. Henry IV himself is boring. He's like an angry father that nobody likes to have. Shakespeare shows Hal engaging him wittily and having a kind of human emotional connection, but all of a sudden, Hal turns cold. And that's a side of his personality that's scary, that is so determined and clear-sighted and politically willful. And you're reminded of the rejection of Falstaff in Henry V also. So that if you want to think about Hal as a warm and fuzzy human being, you can't do that. He can be emotionally engaging, psychologically engaging, interesting as a character, but he's not soft and squishy inside, and he's not loving and gentle as a character. And Falstaff measures that kind of limitation on Hal's or Henry V's character. So I think that how the thing works dramatically in terms of audience attitude means a lot. In the play within a play scene in Henry IV, Part 1, where they're pretending in turn to be father and son. Hal gets to play his father. Falstaff gets to play Henry IV to do a repentance scene. Hal gets to have the last word when Falstaff is saying, banish this, banish that, don't banish Jack Falstaff, and you have that short line where Hal says, "I do, I will," and then Falstaff wants to say something more, but they're interrupted by the arrival of messengers from court. So you have a sense that right there is, I'm going to cut you off. I'm tossing you aside, even though you serve my purpose. Yeah.
Although he does toss him. This is in concert with what you're saying, but he does toss Falstaff aside while offering him a living. He says, don't come in my company, but I'm going to give you enough money so that you're not going to thieve again, and you're not going to commit crimes, which is interesting because I think it speaks to your point, which is he has no personal loyalty, but he's a good enough ruler to know I have to support my lowliest citizens to avoid them engaging in criminal enterprise. okay, this is a controversial idea. If we were, in line with Professor Marotti's paper, to take Falstaff as a representative of errant criminal subjects, if, say, we were to imagine that Falstaff is a recusant, is somebody who has come into the country, who is breaking laws, and what can a ruler do with these subjects? Hal's solution is he has to banish them, or he has to give them some sort of living, but within a kind of political atmosphere of political excommunication. So I think that Falstaff represents something bigger, which is what is a ruler meant to do with those subjects who don't really have a habit of following the law? And so,
well, the model of Falstaff is a man named Sir John Oldcastle of the early part of the century. He's a representative of a faction of kind of proto-Protestant rebels against the church, Lollards they're called, and the serious and John Oldcastle is a hero in Fox's Book of Martyrs, and his descendants are outraged at the way in which Shakespeare is portraying him as a buffoon. He's an aristocrat. He's not a lowlife commoner, but he's an aristocrat gone bad. But when he takes the money from Hal, he misuses it in recruiting soldiers. What the recruiting system for soldiers of the time is: you give somebody a certain amount of money, they go out and they find people to recruit, and they're supposed to use the money for that. What he does is he keeps most of the money and he looks for the worst scarecrows, and he gets people who are husbands or who are husbands of families to buy their way out of military service, and he ends up with a terrible troop of soldiers abusing the charge he's been given.
Yeah, Blake.
Just a comment. I'll step a bit backwards, and sorry about my English. I'll try to speak in English to make things easier.
It's better than our Portuguese.
Thanks. Well, first, you were saying that Shakespeare helps us because he translates in art the political theory and all that. But I would say that Shakespeare is really current and it's really universal. And I'll use a bit of Harold Bloom here to say that because he shows us, and only art can show that really, that human, we are not only Homo sapiens, we are also Homo demens. And this part of demens of the human that say we have fears, we are jealous, we are crazy, we are all that. We are not only the rational part. And this demens part is the same as it was in very old times, and it's the same today, and it's the same through the history and through different countries. We have different cultures and all that, but the human being has something that is equal. And Shakespeare knows that pretty well. And what he shows more, I think, is that kind of part of human, the demons part, is on the power relations. And that's really important. For example, in Julius Caesar, the history, Mark Antony, he won Brutus because Brutus only thought in a very rational way. Brutus only thought the human being as rational, and he made a very logical discourse. And Mark Antony, he knew that the demons is important to maintain power. And then I'll back forward to the question that Rebecca asked about what makes a good ruler. I don't know exactly what makes a good ruler, but two things a good ruler must know. First is that human is not the human sapiens. Homo sapiens, the human is also human demons. And the second one is that power is interaction. So that's why, as you were saying, that the absolute power is not, you cannot be arbitrary. you cannot abuse of power, because power, you only can maintain it if you know that it's an interaction, and an interaction among people that are Homo sapiens and Homo demens. So a good example is Richard III. He got the power through violence, lying and killing a lot of people, but he couldn't maintain himself in power because he only had violence. He didn't saw the power as an interaction between people, and that made him fail. So that was only my comment.
Well, I think that's it's a really excellent point. I mean, I think this, as you say, I mean, part of Shakespeare's, I think, universal appeal is that simultaneous ability to, on the one hand, be representing rule quite practically and pragmatically in terms of laws, constitutions, statutes, but on the other hand, to then really be getting at this other level of goodness, or the daemon, the spirit, the soul of things.
We don't have to make a choice between the Shakespeare of his own time and the Shakespeare who projects himself through history. I think there's both. He's a wonderful psychologist of human behavior, and that allows him to be interpreted and dramatized and acted on the modern stage in many different countries in different ways. But he's also very much of his time, so we need to know the discourses of politics, the discourses of law, the discourses of sovereignty, and the actual histories and micro-histories that he's attuning his plays to. Because to say that, rule or political issues are transcendent and come up to the modern period, that kind of directs us away from some of the information we need to have in order to see how he is really touching the issues that people care about in his own time. But sure, the fact that he's playable and he continues to be played indicates his reach beyond his own period. Yeah.
And I think that your point about a ruler needs both the awareness of daemon and the awareness of relations. And I think this gets to Arthur's point, which is, for us to understand Shakespeare, we both need to know how does he relate to us now, but also what were the relations he was talking about in his day and theorizing. Anyway, thank you.
I wanted to give a footnote on something that Rebecca says. She talked about banishment of Falstaff. I think using a term like banishment, and it's used in King Lear when Kent is banished, and Kent says, "Freedom lives hence and banishment is here," to bring up the issue of exile in a period in which there are lots and lots of Catholic exiles from England resonates with an audience. Now, remember Shakespeare's audience, who it's male and female, people from different strata of society, and it's religiously mixed. There are Catholics, crypto-Catholics in the audience. There are Protestants. There are radical Protestants. So he's addressing a diverse audience in terms of class, in terms of religious belief. So he can press buttons or ring bells in members of his audience. Some people will pick on some things, like a Catholic spectator hearing "Freedom lives hence and banishment is here," will play that in his or her own life as relevant, as somebody else might not hear it quite like that. So remember, the audience is not a homogeneous whole, even in terms of religion and culture and class. Yeah.
Okay, let me just bring together some of the questions here. Somebody, they are not signed, talked about the Aristotelian distinction between a good man and a good citizen, or that a good government must have the qualities of a good citizen, but not necessarily a good ruler should have the qualities of a good citizen, but not necessarily of a good man, right? So in the sense it's asking, is Henry V a good citizen but not a good man? I think reverberating a little bit what has been said. And pretty much to the same point, another question bringing the Aquinas distinction between the natural world and the supernatural world. So I want to get this together with one thing I'd like to hear all of you about. I think there is one tension here. I'm not sure about. Might be the one. Professor Lopez said that to have absolute power does not mean that it is arbitrary power. Now, in order for a power not to be arbitrary, you have to be able to arbitrate whether it's fair or not, whether it's good or not. So you have to have some set of a criteria to arbitrate whether it is a good ruler or not. So that's what arbitrary or non-arbitrary boils down to. Now, and I think you have in here, and in Shakespeare, I think we can see this very clearly, two ways of responding to that. There's this substantive criteria, which would be more medieval maybe, and more attuned to moral qualities, and would be closer to what we would understand as individual morality. I'm not saying they're the same thing, but what I'm saying is that it seems that the medieval response to the criteria for arbitrating whether you're a good ruler or not, this answer has to do, to a great extent, to more substantive perceptions, right? Whereas I think that when we move to the modern perception, it's more the procedural way. So how do you get power, how do you maintain power, so on and so forth, and the substantive matter tends to get lessened, I think. And this, I think, might be a byproduct of the wars of religion, which made it so very hard to come up with one single interpretation of the scriptures that founded sovereign power, or had founded sovereign power for so long. So I'm wondering whether this is a misrepresentation of the two periods, but how do you see this as Shakespeare's skepticism to a certain degree being already a sign of this procedural morality that will, to my view, be so important to modern ages, as opposed to a more substantive morality that might be more likely to triumph in medieval times, with all the caveats that things in history do not go black and white and before and after. But I think that there's this tension here between a substantive morality and a procedural morality, and I think that's a very important part of what's going on in Shakespeare's plays. So, I don't know. Is that? Yep. Sure. Can you use the marker? Yeah.
Well, my point is, I think it's very closely connected with what you said, in the sense that, in my view, in some place, there's a kind of change of this, what you call substantive morality, and maybe we could also call this some kind of political virtues that were inherited from the medieval setting, and also some kind of new value by which you can judge and scrutinize the ruler, which is some kind of efficiency, some kind of capability to deal with the political problems, which I think it's the Machiavellian theme and dimension of politics. And I think this mingles in Shakespeare's plays, and in many ways it's I absolutely agree. It's not only like a clash between the right and wrong from the same paradigm, but it's also a clash of paradigms. And you can see these, I think, for example, in Hamlet or in Claudius' behavior, or Hamlet, which is, who is a character very rich from his moral point of view, his concerns, his consciousness, but he's a very inefficient prince, in the sense that he's not able to take the correct decisions in order to take a grip of the political situation.
There's a term that I think it's a Frankfurt School term for the kind of pragmatic thinking that you're talking about, called instrumental rationality. It's amoral. It's what do I want, how can I get it in the most effective way possible? And, the Shakespearean characters who embodied this the most are Iago and Edmund. So when you bring up the question of moral code versus in relation to sovereignty and exercise of political power, to a certain extent, you raise the question I hope to open out my paper to, and the question of a kind of human moral consensus beyond an individual nation state about what's good and what's evil, and whether it can be acted on. If you talk about the post-moderating power, that was partly to impose a kind of Christian moral standards on the behavior of some bad rulers in medieval times. From that point of view, it's good. It's like a human rights organization with real political power, real political teeth. However, other times it gets exercised on behalf of the bourgeois or some political power that the papacy has been captured by. So Henry VIII probably would have gotten his divorce if Spanish control of the papacy hadn't been there, and you wouldn't have had a break with Rome on Henry's part. Although he probably would have needed more divorces anyway till he got to a male child. That would have postponed the problem maybe.
No, that's true, because politically, part of, I think, Henry's surprise in not being granted the right of divorce, I mean, he shouldn't have been surprised because, of course, his first wife was, in fact, related to the Pope. But part of the surprise was that other rulers had been granted that exact thing. So, yeah.
And so I wanted to raise the problem that gets beyond Shakespeare, but also I think you're right to say that this old moderating influence of this power beyond the state is kind of disappearing in the modern world. What do we have in place of it? And should there be something in place of it? There's a general consensus that there's a threshold of international outrage that can be reached. It's reached in Rwanda, in Darfur, in the killing fields in Cambodia, whatever. Sometimes the international community acts on that outrage. Sometimes it doesn't. It did in terms of selective action in the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. But should there be a kind of transnational power? Now, establishing the United Nations is to some extent a move in the direction of having this kind of moral political authority operating in the community of nations.
Right, but sorry,
it doesn't always work.
Sorry, but the United Nations is clearly procedural. That's the problem. I mean, it's clearly procedural. I mean, what you're deciding on the United Nations is a procedure. Okay, we have to decide things by talking.
Although let's take the example
right.
You brought up of Syria.
Right. Okay.
The issue of Syria is coming up before the UN. It's being brought up as a kind of register of international outrage for an armed government for massacring protesting citizens. First unarmed citizens, now they're armed. Now it's becoming more like a civil war. Mm-hmm. Is the UN capable of exercising this kind of influence? I don't know. There's a way in which, through the internet and social networking, that community outrage, moral outrage, is being expressed in certain circumstances. In the U.S. recently, there was this move started by just one person to call the world attention to this African rebel Kony, who was conscripting child soldiers and doing a lot of raping of women. And this has been going on in Uganda and neighboring countries for a while. He managed to marshal enough world opinion to shine a spotlight on this so that those who maybe should have been acting more are moving a little bit more to try to hunt him down and stop what he's doing. But it's a problem. There's no institution, there's no single institution that has stepped in to do what the medieval papacy did. Do we need one? Well, yeah, sometimes we say we do need it to prevent genocide and things like that. Yeah.
Just going back to what Joseph said very well. Yes, we have the chart, right, of the United Nations, but it's been under attack for being perhaps biased towards the West and Western values. And so that's what I'm saying. If this is not a crisis of modern substantive morality, modern procedural morality, has a hard time dealing with issues would require some sort of substantive morality. Once we believe that morality is cultural based, right? And the papacy could, in a way, act across borders because you did not believe that other values or other things were equally important.
But I think that there's a growing consensus about basic human rights that are not just Western European Enlightenment or originated list. Certainly, the right for citizens not to be murdered,
Right.
is basic. The right of an ethnic minority not to be massacred, not to be, as the Armenians were, driven out on a kind of death march. The question becomes difficult when it comes to cultures that, say, have different definitions of relations of men and women. Patriarchal cultures, like Islamic ones or what we had in Afghanistan. Are there basic rights that women have internationally, universally, that people will agree upon? You're not going to get that agreement now.
Yeah,
Maybe
you
you
don't
will.
get it in the U.S.
Maybe you will. Maybe you will in 50 years. I don't know. But that it's still evolving. But there is some international consensus about some basic human rights. Right of free expression for citizens, free political expression. So they have a say in what their government is. It's not absolute now, but we're getting close to it.
But that's also where you get into, and this is why the UN is, I think, quite interesting, where you get into, as you're suggesting, there are emergent consensuses around certain types of rights, but then you get into the enforcement problem of people may agree, yes, indeed, this country deserves a sanction or this behavior deserves sanction, but what action, who's going to act, and okay, you might act under the auspices of the UN, but I think this is one of the questions that the UN gets into, where then the United States is funding certain portions of the UN, or the United States becomes the kind of behavioral arm in certain moments where, okay, UN troops go in, that's not effective, and so then you have American troops go in. Are they acting under the banner of the UN, or are they acting under the banner of American foreign policy, right? So it's like, anyway, so I think it's just, there are tiers of sort of the theory and then the enforcement practices where it gets quite messy. It's just amplifying what you're saying.
Well, so we are in the same situation as Shakespeare was at that time.
Yeah.
That what's next? Right. Is the Pope going to come back, and or who's going to rule, right, exactly. And under what conditions? So just to
who's going to rule what?
Who's going to rule? Yeah, and how and by what standards? By which standards? So that's
one of the interesting things that happened in the Oath of Allegiance controversy. The government under James wanted to make sure that they could force a loyalty oath on Catholics.
Right.
And so they went to an ex-Jesuit who was now on the English side and got his help in formulating a question, an oath that went further than it needed to go in formulating Catholic loyalty. In the oath, it states that anyone who believes that the Pope has deposing power is adhering to an heretical doctrine. That means that the state and the king have a right to say what heresy is. Now, there's a case of the Pope may be overreaching in temporal power, but there's a case of the state overreaching in spiritual power and saying what is orthodox and what is heretical. For the Catholic to swear to that, saying, I'm going to accept your definition of heresy. Oh.
Because they still believed that their kingdom was a Christian commonwealth. So they had overcome the idea of a power, of a temporal power by the Pope, but they had not overcome the idea of a Christian commonwealth, which is the last book of Hobbes' Leviathan, which is exactly that. The third book, not the last one. So, yeah. But I was going back to Shakespeare and say that what's interesting, one of the ways you can read that is he's universal in a way. He's universal in two ways, at least. First, because his characters have to act. So drama and tragedy come out of action that has to be taken or is suffered by them. And so he brings back the idea, which is essential in politics, I would say, is that people have to act. That it's the field of action in which you have to make decisions and create things that were not there before you acted. And this is put into a dramatic and tragic way in several of the plays. So the other thing is, when you're dealing with the characters, with the kings in the plays, then they have to act in two different levels. They have to act as individuals. They have to make choices that will affect their lives and the lives of those who are immediately related to them, families and friends and everything, as you were discussing in the case of Falstaff and everything. But he has to act in the field of public consequences, and different characters will deal with that differently, like Macbeth and Richard III, the tyrant, and Henry V. So I think that still is action, and that still is important. I was when we were discussing, I was remembering that one of the definitions or one of the sayings around justice that the philosophers would use is that justice is a cold virtue. It's cold. You have to be cold to be just, and that's why you cannot be judged in your own case or in the case of people who are next to you, because to them and to yourself you owe different obligations. But when you're acting as a just judge, then you have to be set apart from the interests of the parties. That's typical. And I think in many of the plays, what you have is this. And then, of course, in a circumstance, in a historical period of turmoil and in a stormy weather at that time, how can you find this cold place from which you will decide things? So I think this is what is also part of the fascination with the plays of these of Shakespeare.
But Shakespeare stages in the law a conflict between the two orders, justice and equity. Justice is by the book, by the rules. Equity is taking the human circumstances into account. And a play like Measure for Measure is a good example of that. Or it comes up as an issue in The Merchant of Venice. So justice needs equity, but equity needs the kinds of standards and the legal clarity of justice.
It requires sympathy sometimes.
Yes,
some sort of
right.
empathy.
Right.
So you're right.
Yeah.
Could you? Sorry.
It's okay. So let's just try to get things going. So we have two more questions, okay? And then we're gonna have a good lunch break, and I'll explain later on what's gonna happen. But then, please, Professor Galindo, and then Professor Cesar.
Yeah, I think this discussion is really rich. I'd like to stress 2 points, and I think the first point is on that debate about the duty or the right of the United Nations to intervene in Syria, for example. I think maybe I would like to hear from you how the context in which Shakespeare wrote his plays is different or not from the context we live now. I'm not sure if the context is quite the same. Of course, it's not the same, but I don't think it's quite similar, because I think something happened after Shakespeare plays or after Shakespeare's life, which is the difference between, in legal thought, especially in legal thought, the difference between law and morality. In Shakespeare, law and morality, and especially international morality and international legality, are intermingled. Now, for example, in the debate on Syria, I don't think the discussion is only about has the United Nations the right, the moral right to do that? But now maybe the issue is, has the United Nations the duty to act, the duty to do something like that? An intervention. So I'd like to hear from you the difference between Shakespeare context in which law and morality were intermingled, and now when you can see a moral argument and a legal argument that can be posed differently. Second point is, I think Professor Marotti, I think a premise you established in the very beginning of your presentation was very important, and I think it helps us to think about the role of law, especially if we take into account Shakespeare plays. You said in the very beginning of your presentation that one of the social functions Shakespeare saw in his plays was that he would like to foster a contestation. And I think this is very important for us lawyers because law is essentially contestation.
Law students were a big part of his audience.
Yeah. And I would like to hear from you and from Professor Lemon as well. How do you think the social function of the play for Shakespeare can help us to see things better in terms of law? I mean, if we foster also the idea of promoting contestation, how this can develop law in the future, or can develop our legal thoughts or the way we organize society?
A couple of things come to mind. When you deal with the drama, you've got to remember that the drama is an important mass medium in Shakespeare's time. There are several occasions in which people gather in large groups to hear ideas. One is sermons at church, which the state tries to control by having an official book of homilies, which are read in every church. So after the 1569 Northern Rebellion, there's a homily against rebellion and willful disobedience that stays in the book forever. But preachers also preach their own sermons. And you get all sorts of religio-political opinions being floated, including sermons to the king or queen, where they are made to listen to things they don't want to listen to. James complained about this, about his royal chaplains coming and telling him things he didn't want to hear. So there's the sermons, people get together, and it's a forum for different kinds of ideas. You get public executions, which get big crowds. That is the state saying, if and especially in the case of executions of missionary priests, or of people convicted of treason, if you attack the state, we're going to exercise our right to dismember your body. We'll hang you and we'll draw and quarter you, and we'll display your body parts on the gates of London. So it's a teaching moment for the state to tell the populace certain things about. We will not tolerate certain things, and we'll tear you apart if you do it. But people go to executions with different motives. The priests who were executed had Catholics and Protestants in their audiences, and they had a chance to make a speech at the scaffold before they died. That could be a very subversive speech. When they were died and dismembered, some people would come forth with handkerchiefs and dip them in their blood and keep them as relics of a martyr. So the instruction that the state wanted to give, here's what a traitor deserves, wasn't being read that way by some people. So it's a controversial kind of moment. They looked at bear baitings and animal baitings. Some theaters were used for both. They watched a bear or a bull set upon by dogs, English bulldogs, and watched as the bears became like wrestling champions. They have names, and they'd kill so many dogs that were attacking them. It's a way of letting off social anger and social steam to have this kind of violent sport displayed. But then there's theater. And in the theater, say you have, 5-6 theaters operating at any one time? 5 or 6 public theaters, most of them with a capacity of 2,000 to 3,000 people, playing every day. Do the math. In a city of 200,000 people or so, there are a lot of people going to the theater and being exposed to ideas and stage conflicts of ideas. So it's in a period in which you don't have a free press, It's a very censored press, and the newspaper doesn't really start till several decades later. The theater is the one place where they can stage debates between different ideologies and different theories of monarchy. Take the play Julius Caesar. There are two ways of reading the story of Julius Caesar. Dante's way. Caesar is a monarch who is assassinated by a traitor who deserves to be chewed up by the devil in hell. He and Cassius are being munched on by Satan in the center of hell. There's the other way in saying that Brutus is like a return of the legendary Brutus in Roman history who overthrew the tyrant Tarquin, and he's a champion of Roman liberty and republicanism. So he's a hero in one story, and he's a terrible villain in another. Shakespeare kind of deflects some of the nasty part of Brutus onto a character like Cassius and makes Brutus kind of naive in many ways and well-meaning and conflicted. But the double story is still implicit in the play. Is it good to have a kind of absolute monarch or emperor, or is it good to have a republic, which has all sorts of corruption built into it? King James got bothered by another forum of debate at the university. He heard that at Oxford they were debating whether monarchy is the best form of government. Whether monarchy is the best form of government. Here's a man articulating the theory of divine right, kingship, and at the university they're saying, well, maybe that's not the best. Maybe a republic's better. Well, that's very subversive. But the theater reaches the biggest audience for conflicting ideas and staging these debates, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a culturally vibrant institution in the time.
Sir.
Thank you. My question is actually very simple. You mentioned equity, and I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on that, because I think it connects equity is connected to the characteristics of the king.
Yes.
Because and then it's when, in legal terms, you depend on those.
Yeah. There's a very good book by a scholar named Leah Marcus and in it she talks about the play Measure for Measure as staging a conflict between really King James's conception of he comes from a country which is a separate country then, Scotland, that is ruled by civil law as continental countries are. And he believes in a strong notion of royal prerogative and the right of the monarch to exercise mercy and equity. And so in the case of Measure for Measure, you have a story that shows you a kind of monarchical exercise of equity that overrides the interpretation of the strict letter of the law at a lower level. So there's a fight between James and the Parliament. Basically, I think it has to do with, ultimately which system of law England should have. He tries between 1604 and 1610 to get Parliament to approve a unification of Scotland and England. They won't do it. One of the reasons is Parliament has a lot of lawyers in it, and they make their living off the common law. But also, constitutionally, English law is tied to a common law tradition, which is not a top-down deductive thing from a set of stable categories, but rather a kind of accumulation of precedents, legal precedents that are in case law. Now, it's Koch, I guess, among others, who is doing research into medieval legal precedents, which is very disruptive to the king, because he doesn't want people to find all these medieval precedents that give power to Parliament, give power to anybody other than the king. So, in a play like Measure for Measure, Shakespeare is staging this set of alternatives between civil law and common law. In the English law courts, there are two kinds of courts. There are the church courts, which govern sexual behavior and inheritance, maybe. And Rebecca knows a lot more about this than I do. And there are equity courts that are.
And the church courts are governed by civil law.
Yeah, by civil law. And the equity courts, which can override the decisions of common law courts. Rebecca will talk about this, about the legal situation.
No, you're doing a perfect job.
So one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that, here in Brazil, you're in the civil law tradition. Anglo-American law is in the common law tradition, and it works differently. And it's tied to a different notion of, I think, of political rights. The civil law tradition is much more friendly to strong central leaders, monarchs or whatever. The common law tradition is much more messy and negotiable. And, England still doesn't have a constitution the way the U.S. does, the way many other countries do. It's a kind of accumulation of things. They go to the Magna Carta, but that's a very muddy document in terms of application to a whole series of English centuries following it. It doesn't have a constitution. It has all these precedents.
Want to comment on this? Okay, so first of all, I have to thank you all. Thank you, Professor Marotti for his talk, Professor Lopez for his comments, Professor Rebecca Lemon for her comments as well, and everybody for questions and everything. So we're going to have a break for lunch now. In the afternoon, we're going to have, an open session for questions, but the different thing is that students will lead the debate, right? So we're going to have our graduate and undergraduate students who are going to bring questions, and from what I've seen, some very interesting topics are about to come up. Women, the role of women in Elizabethan society, the rights of the way they were perceived and political implications of that, the borders between private and public, and which is a very, very messy issue. The problem of revenge, which was central, right, a very problematic moral topic for Elizabethans and Jacobeans, and which will bring back, of course, the issue of morality, state, subject, so on and so forth. So that's the afternoon session. Tomorrow morning, of course, Professor Rebecca Lemon will be giving her talk on Richard II and what makes a tyrant or what doesn't make a tyrant, and Professor Ronaldo Portomacedo will be commenting and will be discussing this. But I want to thank you all once again. We'll be back at 2:30. 2:30 we'll be back at the debates. Thank you very much all.